Hello, my name is Cynthia Burke, and I'm going to be sharing today the paper called Real-Time Monitoring of User Stress, Heart Rate, and Heart Rate Variability on Mobile Devices. And the authors for this paper are on the slide here, as well as the affiliations with universities and institutions. The problem this paper tries to tackle is dealing with stress, and how over the past couple of years, it has shown that overall everyone's stress levels are higher than they normally are, and even by the World Health Organization, it's being labeled as a health epidemic of the 21st century. And this is when someone's under stress for such a long period of time, it can definitely make the body, they can weaken the body's immune system. It can have a lot of negative impacts on our everyday health. And one thing that has been found to be the leading stressor currently within our society is having access to mobile devices. And this can include social media, such as Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, as well as not only social media, but even having games on our phone. Even if they're for fun, it's still shown to be a stressor, having such access to readily available information. And so the authors of this paper, their proposed solution is to be able to track and monitor stress in our everyday lives within real time. And to do so, they proposed making a mobile device, utilizing mobile devices since they're so easy to use and readily available, using mobile devices to help monitor and track stress in our everyday life. The main contributions this paper brings are two things. Firstly, that they've developed the Beam AI software development kit, and this is split up into two subcategories of the Beam AI Lite and the Beam AI browser. I'll be going into more detailed discussion on these later. All that is essential to know now is that these two demos of the Beam AI software development kit, their goal is to monitor and track in real time a user's stress and to monitor over a long period of time as well as track it in the moment. And along with this software development kit, the authors then empirically evaluated this on two benchmarks, the UBFC and the MMSEHR, as well as they've also tested it on their own internal datasets. And after doing these empirical evaluations, it is shown that the Beam AI SDK can achieve nearly twice as better accuracy when estimating heart rate compared to the norms right now of even the Apple Watch. And it also has an average Pearson correlation of 0.801 in estimating stress and heart rate variability compared to the state of the art, which includes the Fitbit, the Apple Watch, as well as other more specific estimatings. So what exactly is this Beam AI SDK? A brief overview of what exactly it's doing is it's tracking and monitoring a user's overall stress levels in real time through the front camera. So essentially, what you're going to do is have a downloaded app, and what this app does, you open it, and it has your front camera on so it can see your face, and it can then measure your stress, your heart rate, and then your heart rate variability. And we'll go into more detail later about how exactly it can measure these three things. But essentially, the brief overview is it's going to be two main steps. It's going to get your face, it's going to then output a pulse wave, and then it's going to calculate out the three measurements, the stress, the heart rate, and the heart rate variability. And you can see on the bottom here a nice figure that shows one stage going into the next one until the output, the total output, is going to be those three numbers. Now looking at this in more depth, I'm going to split it up from what we saw last slide into just the first stage. So the first stage would be you open the app, and it has a picture of your face. It's using your front camera, and using that camera, it's going to see very minute differences in coloration across your face. And from these differences in coloration, it's going to output or extract a unique pulse wave at that exact given moment in real time. So you can have your camera on, and in real time it can accurately tell your pulse and extract it so it can use it for the next stage we'll see in a second. From this pulse wave, which we saw from the first one, we've gotten this pulse wave from finding differences in coloration across our skin. It outputs that pulse wave, and for the input of this one in stage 2 now, we input the wave itself, the entire pulse wave, at that exact moment. And from this input, we can output the three measurements of stress, the user's heartbeat, and the heartbeat variability when analyzing this pulse wave. And we're going to go into more detail about how exactly we analyze this in a second. However, this is just the brief overview of you open the camera of the app, and then from that it can scan across your face and output this pulse wave, which then, as input to this stage 2, the pulse wave is then able to analyze and compute the stress, the heartbeat, and then the heartbeat variability for a user. And this stress is going to be measured in the Bievsky's stress index, which we're going to discuss more about later with the formulas. Now going into even more detail, we saw before how this was the broad strokes of the big overview of what Beam AI SDK is doing and what its goal is in outputting the 3 metrics in stress, heartbeat, and heartbeat variability. So now we're going to go into more detail on how exactly it does this and the technologies behind that. And essentially it splits up into 3 different sections. The first section being the pulse extractor, the second one being the biometric estimator, and the third one being the interbeat interval processor. And what the first one is doing, the pulse extractor, what it's doing is it's activating the camera session from your phone, and it's going to be stored and managed within the actual SDK itself. And what's happening is every single frame it's updating the wave pulses it's generating out to then be calculated on. So the pulse extractor is doing is just continuously updating every frame to extract wave pulses for the reader. And then with those wave pulses, we're going to go to the interbeat interval processor, and this is going to keep track of all the user's pulse waves from the pulse extractor. And what's happening is it's going to calculate out the interbeat intervals. So between every wave that the pulse extractor pulls out, it's going to calculate the ones between that and find the difference between the peaks in every pulse. And so this is going to keep the interbeat intervals. So seeing the difference between 2 different waves, essentially, and finding where they peak and the intervals between those times. And using these interbeat intervals, what's then going to happen is the biometric estimator is going to use a window of t seconds to analyze these interbeat intervals, and then within this window of t seconds, it's going to produce results for the heartbeat variability, and stress. And a key note for the biometric estimator is that every time you launch the app, it's going to initialize this window of t seconds. So whenever you first launch the app, it'll tell you to wait for 5 seconds, and that would be the t seconds for where it's just going to scan and get a bunch of waves, and it needs to find the difference between those waves within 5 seconds to then be able to produce outputs. Now to look into more depth about how we're actually doing the calculations. So for the heart rate specifically, we're going to talk about the same window of time we were talking about last slide, that t seconds, and we're going to look at the difference between the wave pulses we're sending, so the interbeat intervals, the differences between the waves for within 5 seconds, for example. And on the very bottom of this column, we can see the pulse image, and this is the function used to then output a heart rate estimation. And a key note would be that the set of what's in the curly braces within pulse as the input, that is just the set of the different intervals, interbeat intervals. So a bunch of different pulse waves are being input into this, and then we can then output our pulse estimation, or heart rate. And then going to the next one, to heart rate variability, this is going to look at the change between beat intervals, just like heart rate, over a given time window, and this is going to look for the difference where this is how much your heart rate varies within a specific time frame. And this is reported within the standard deviation of IBI of normal sinus beats, which is SDNN. And this SDNN is going to be measured in milliseconds for the result. And lastly, we're going to look at how we calculate stress. And this calculation is going to be done according to the Bievsky stress index. And this metric is essentially the best in the state-of-the-art technology for measuring physiological stress. And for this paper, there's a key note that they had to switch. On the very bottom of the stress column, you can see a function called SI, stress index, and we're going to input that same set of interbeat intervals to this function as well. And the difference between the standard Bievsky stress index and the one that this paper is using is on the very bottom in the denominator, the multiplication of 3.9 times SDNN of the entire set. That is the new variation they did on the stress index for this paper. And what this is doing, why they decided to change this, is whenever in the original formula, it's looking across the entire span of every different set of interbeat intervals. It's looking at the full range of that. However, they found out in practice through evaluation, it's actually better to only look at 95% of the range within the sets, or within the set of all the intervals. and therefore we're going to look at only 95% of the range instead of the full range, and that's what they did. And this was purely just to get better results out. Now to look at the examples of the alternatives to Beam AI SDK. And essentially, these are the two demos that the authors of the paper have created using this software development kit. And these are both available on the actual iOS App Store and on their GitHub pages, which are going to be referenced in my slides at the very end. So you can actually download these apps right now or use them however you would like. And these two apps being the Beam AI Lite and then the Beam AI browser. And the one I've been showing like the past couple slides is the Beam AI Lite, which essentially you open up and it's the front-facing camera, and it just outputs the stress, the heart rate, and then the heart rate variability. And this is just demonstrating the monitoring features that the Beam AI SDK offers. The Beam AI browser, on the other hand, is doing the same thing as the AI Lite, where you have the front-facing camera and it's still monitoring and outputting your stress. However, you can also multitask, and you can have open your maps for driving into school, or you can have your maps, a game open, for example, like I have the image on the bottom. This is Flappy Bird, and you can monitor your stress while you're doing something online. Like, for example, if the game is very stressful, it would be able to then output it to you. So you can look that way and see if what you're doing on your phone impacts your stress level at any point, and you can get real-time results back. So now that we know exactly what the Beam AI SDK is, how it's being able to compute everything, the authors of the paper then were able to experiment on it, and the metrics they've used to run these evaluations were the following. They did mean average error, mean average percentage error, and then root mean squared error, as well as a Pearson correlation. And one thing to note about these images is that these were all pulled from the paper itself. However, some of them, as you can see, have typos in them. When you like, all of them start with MAE. However, the second image is supposed to say MAPE, and the third one's supposed to say RMSE. But this was purely a typo on their part, and I wanted to use the images from the actual paper itself instead of pulling out other images, because they have specific sets as the input to these functions, which you see here, where the set of y sub I to y hat is the predicted labels that this is able to output. So in this case, it would be the predicted heart rate or the predicted heart variation. Whereas the set of y is going to be all the actual ground truth values. So these are able to then, determining the prediction and comparing it to the truth, get all these metrics out. The first benchmark that the authors tested their SDK on was the UBFC, and this is a dataset containing 42 RGB videos with one unique subject per video, so that's 42 differing subjects total. And the resolution of these videos was 640 by 480 at 30 FPS. And then every single video had a corresponding pulse wave signal, and along with that, every single video had the subject doing a puzzle as some certain stimuli for the video. The ground truth signal for every one of these videos, the first thing the authors wanted to do was clean out the unwanted frequencies, and this is essentially to be between a reasonable heart rate. And to do so, they applied a second-order Butterworth filter. Then the next thing they did was, using SciPy, they extracted the interbeat intervals and produced the ground truth heart rate for every single video. So this was essentially just to pull out the ground truth to then compare to the prediction. And to get this prediction, every video was passed through the Python implementation of the 3 SDK sections we saw earlier: the pulse processor, the interbeat interval, and then the estimator. And once it was passed through, we were able to get the Beam SDK prediction. And at the very bottom of the slide, you can see the overall benchmark scores with the MAE, MAPE, RMSE, and then the Pearson correlation. And the ones in bold are the ones that are doing the state-of-the-art, the best currently. So the Beam AI SDK performed best in the MAE, MAPE, and then the Pearson correlation. The next evaluation that the authors wanted to do was perform the MMSE HR benchmark, and this dataset was 102 videos that supported 40 different subjects, and each video had different stimuli to randomize it and give variety. And the ground truth signal, they again wanted to filter out all the necessary frequencies, but however, the difference this time was they wanted to also extract the dominant frequency, and that they did so by using the fast Fourier transformation and then multiplying it by 60, and this would produce the ground truth heart rate in beats per minute. And then again, they did the same thing with the Beam AI SDK predictions through the Python implementation, and at the bottom you can see that this one performed the best out of all the other options on all metrics. The authors did actually have to redo the UBFC benchmark, and the difference was this time they had to manually hand verify all the pulse peaks, and this is due to the fact that they used SciPy for the last one, and what happened when they used SciPy was it generated some false pulse peaks, and they didn't actually occur there, so in response to figuring this out, they had to go in and manually check every peak with this benchmark to ensure that it was actually a correct peak. And as you can see on the bottom, this image, the results do differ from the original UBFC benchmark. However, the Pearson correlation is still very high, and it didn't differ too drastically. The last thing that the authors tested their data on was their own internal data, and this consisted of one 20-minute recording of one of the authors using their iPhone 13, and it was split up into two different parts. The first 10 minutes of the video was just the subject holding their phone and using it naturally, and then the second half of the video was them moving around and also setting it to rest nearby while they are at work. And the videos do have this range of motion going from a seated position to standing, and also to having different lighting changes to test the Beam AI in all different types of conditions. And the ground truth signal, this was observed by, firstly, the subject would wear a polar H10 chest strap in the video, and then to extract their pulse from this, they use an app called Elite HRV, and it's available on the iOS. And the interbeat interval data was then synchronized to estimate the stress, the heart rate, and heart rate variability. And on the very bottom of the slide, you can see the metrics there for all of those different testings. These are visuals to demonstrate how close the polar H10 was with Beam AI when extracting the pulse rate, as well as the heart rate variability over 60-second windows. So as you can see, both of them, they do have different variations. However, they're very similar, and they don't stray too far apart for longer than, I'd say, at least 5 seconds before they do match up again. Again, these are just more demonstrations to show this time stress and also heart rate estimation compared to the Apple Watch. So the image on top shows stress estimation from the Polar H10 and then the Beam AI. And as you can see, the Beam AI does spike higher whenever there are peaks. They are much greater than what the Polar H10 is showing. However, the overall flow and pattern is fairly similar. And as you can see with the graph on the bottom, this is comparing the Polar H10, the Beam AI, and the Apple Watch with heart rate estimation. So they're all very similar. The biggest glaring issue I see is around the later half of the bottom graph with the major dip with Beam AI. All the other ones show that it's fairly towards the center. However, Beam AI just dips hard, very close to zero. And this could be an anomaly, or it could show that there are differences, even if they're very minute. To quickly go over the processing speeds, Beam AI SDK is evaluated using an iPhone 13, and the other comparisons here in this chart are run on something called the ARM CPU. And as you can see here, the Beam AI uses the least time in milliseconds to process all this and evaluate the stress, the heart rate, and the heart rate variability. This is very low compared to the other methods that are using up to 30 milliseconds. As for the strengths and weaknesses of this paper, the strengths, I thought the biggest strength for it was that it was such a novel idea. I've never heard of someone trying to accomplish monitoring stress in real time, let alone through an app on the phone. I've never heard of that, so I definitely thought it was a novel idea. And I also did like how much rigorous testing they did to empirically evaluate their methods, especially whenever I found out they made a mistake in the original one and they went back to fix their own mistake. I like that a lot. And then I also like how much documentation they have available. They also do have their GitHubs for everything posted, and I have the link to them in the references on my last slide. So if anyone feels free to reach out and use those, you can go ahead. And they have their own GitHub links available, as well as it's all on the App Store. So if you wanted to try it, all you have to do is search Beam AI Lite or Beam AI browser, and you can find it on the App Store. Currently it's only on iOS, but it might be sometime in the future on more devices. And then the weaknesses for this paper, the biggest weaknesses to me was that there was no medical grade equipment done at all with evaluation. The equipment they used to test, anyone could have gotten and used, and anyone could, there was no medical grade equipment tested at all. So, as for medical field relation, it doesn't hold up to standards of medical grade. However, they did do the best that they could with the equipment that was available to them. And the other weaknesses I found was that there were some small typos as well as confusing formatting choices that just overall made it very hard to follow, and I had to read through multiple times to make sure I understood correctly. With all these strengths and weaknesses, my overall rating for this paper would be a 3, and this is essentially to say if it gets accepted, that's great, but I wouldn't be disappointed if it wasn't also accepted, because the weaknesses were very big in my opinion, with there not being any medical grade testing. If this is supposed to be a medical paper, I feel like that must happen eventually. But this was a great first novel approach to this idea that no other paper I've seen has done yet. So that was definitely its biggest strength, was how novel the idea was. So as for future directions, the authors are currently stating that they're undergoing even more empirical studies with more data on more different test subjects on a variety of different tasks. And the authors do eventually want to make it cross-platform. So right now it's only on iOS, but they do want to make it for the Android as well as make it available for PC or desktop. And in the future, I would personally love to see it apply to more general tasks, even just calling, emailing, playing games on your phone, or texting people, seeing if like you can even have it more applied to those general tasks that everyone does. And I also do think it'd be way better to test it on more noisy environments rather than just good lighting indoors. Like, what if we tested it outside, or tested it with a storm outside? So the lighting would be different. Testing it with more noise would definitely help strengthen how good this Beam AI SDK is at extracting the pulse waves. Thank you so much for listening. Let me know if you have any questions on anything. Thank you.